We talk a lot on this show about specific issues, cultural issues, social issues, and a lot of nuanced philosophical and theological concepts. But at the end of the day, what are the basic arguments that form the foundation of a solid Christian apologetic? In our post Christian culture, it's imperative that believers at least know the basics in order to become effective ambassadors for Christ in their proclamation and defense of the gospel. So I hope you'll join us for part one of a three-part series with SES Provost Dr. Richard Howe as we discussed 9 essential arguments for effective Christian apologetics. I'm Adam Tucker with Southern Evangelical Seminary, and this is Why Do You Believe? Well, welcome back to another episode of Why Do You Believe, the podcast and live stream of Southern Evangelical Seminary and Bible College. As always, I hope you're enjoying our weekly content, and I will continue to remind you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this video, like our Facebook page. Make sure you're notified when we're going live so that you can enjoy the content. And as always, you can visit ses.edu, click on the Media tab, and find where you can download our SES mobile app, which has archives of all of these programs, the podcast version of these, the audio version of these, if you prefer that format, in addition to over 500 hours of other apologetics content, all for free on the SES Apologetics mobile app. So you can find that at ses.edu. So be sure to check that out. And of course, our videos and everything are archived on YouTube and on our Facebook page as well. So those are easily accessible. So please enjoy those, learn from those, and share those. And we appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and just jump right in. And I'm going to bring in our guest for the day, who is no stranger to the show, Dr. Richard G. Howe, SES Provost.
He may be strange, but he's no stranger.
That's right. He is the SES Provost and also holds the Norman Geisler Chair of Christian Apologetics. I hope that chair's not very heavy. I'm sure your arms get tired after a while.
Holding it all day long.
That's right. That's a tall order. But Dr. Howe, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to get to speak with you.
Hey, listen, thanks, man. I love these opportunities. They had to convert it, though, into a high chair for me to sit in. but it fits okay. You know, what I really love, Adam, is when it's finally time to just talk about things at the simplest level we can, I'm the first person that people come to mind to want to talk to about it. Let's talk to Richard. He knows where the cookies are on the shelf. So. No, I'm so excited about this. You and I could do this, and I would have fun even if it wasn't being streamed.
Well, I'll tell you, I am truly, and this is no joke, I'm honored to call you a friend and a mentor, so it's always a pleasure to get to talk with you, whether personally or on a podcast, so it's great.
Great, thank you.
And of course, the truth of the matter is, in order to explain things simply, you have to understand them in depth, which is why we call Dr. Richard Howe for these sorts of things. So I'm curious. I'm curious though, what are you working on right now, other than our show, obviously? But what other things are you into at the moment?
So, obviously things connected directly with the seminary. Got some grading still hanging over me from the last term. Got some prep coming up for courses this fall that we're going to be talking about during this hour. But then also as the opportunity affords to do some collateral reading, always enjoy just trying to expand the horizons, as they say. And Adam, I'm very excited about the opportunities that have come my way to do a bunch of Zoom sessions with people around the world. I've got a contingency of friends in South Africa that we meet every Friday. I've got some in the U.S. that we meet once a week. All doing apologetics and philosophy, so it's keeping me frosty for sure.
That is awesome. And I know we're keeping you busy with media interviews and those sorts of things, so we appreciate that, and you're doing a great job, you and several of our other professors, so
Oh,
Keep that up.
absolutely. Those things are exciting. I mean, they are anywhere from a 90-second quick thing on a television or radio to an entire hour. And so they really keep me honest and trying to make sure I'm ahead of the game. You never know what kind of Q&A is going to come
Hmm.
up. So it's a privilege to be sure. And my hope is actually that it will fall out to the furtherance of God's kingdom, but also SES's part in the furtherance of God's kingdom, how we can increase our visibility throughout the world
Hmm.
as a resource. Because as we'll get into, we know that we have a perspective to offer here that is almost absent everywhere else you go in evangelicalism. Very, very rare. So hopefully we'll get to unpack that a little bit in the next three sessions.
Yeah,
This one in
definitely.
the next two, rather.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so we do want to take about 3 episodes here to dive into the fundamentals of what we're convinced, at least, makes for really a complete case for the truthfulness of Christianity. So we've just recently released a new infographic that lays out just the highlights of 9 essential arguments for effective Christian apologetics. So I would encourage our listeners, our viewers to download that. You can do that for free at ses.edu/infographic. Appropriate title, I suppose, ses.edu/infographic.
Well, you paid a lot of money for that name,
That's
didn't you?
right. That's right. So the graphic itself is broken down into 3 main sections. So we have philosophical foundations, which we'll talk about today, classical apologetics tenets, and then the specific case for Christianity itself when we get into the Bible and the resurrection and those kind of things. So like I said, today we're going to focus on the philosophical foundation. And to me, at least, these philosophical foundations are really not only the most important pieces to the puzzle. They may not have the most important implications, but they're the important pieces to the puzzle of Christianity's truthfulness. But they're also, as you said, largely the most misunderstood and or neglected.
Mhm.
So some of the things may sound strange to some of our listeners or viewers as a weird place to start in a conversation such as this. But as Aristotle says, as you know, a small error in the beginning leads to a large error or many errors in the end. So, Dr. Howe, some folks may think, especially at SES, that we just talk too much about philosophy. We don't talk about the Bible enough or theology enough. We talk too much about philosophy. So, first of all, do you think that's the case? And secondly, just what exactly is philosophy anyway, and why is it so important?
Well, I have to admit, there is a sense in which it's a little self-serving for me to talk about whether or not we do or don't talk too much about philosophy, because I'm always going to say, well, probably don't talk about it enough, even at SES. But I grant that we can't talk about it as much as philosophy geeks sometimes might want to talk about it. But, you said something just a second ago that I thought was an important, really clarification of the point I had made just before. And that when I said it was largely absent, but I like the way you say it, namely, it's either neglected or it's misunderstood. That is, it's being the idea of philosophy. And I think that's critical for people to get right at the very beginning. We're not suggesting that nobody else out there in the apologetic community is addressing some of the same things that philosophy addresses, and indeed may even do it with a deliberate philosophy in mind. So we're not saying that necessarily, but there is that segment of the church at large, and by extension, the seminary community within evangelicalism, that do neglect philosophies. Particularly, you find this in the presuppositionalist camp that characterize philosophy as man's word, as somehow in competition with, in conflict with revealed truth. But what we're really trying to do as apologists and as classical apologists is to factor in God's revelation of himself through creation. So still God's revelation in a sense. It's not propositional like scripture is, but it is God revealing himself through the things that he's made, as Romans 1:20 tells us. So we're trying to be conscientious about how that looks. So that sort of responds to those who neglect it crowd. But what about the ones who misconstrue it or whatever. There, then we have legitimate philosophical differences of opinion. Maybe we can get into some of those as we go along. I'll let you guide me because I don't want to just, in answer to your first general question, do we talk too much about philosophy, go into all the specifics. So we contend earnestly that there is some critical role that the philosophy not only ought to play, but never fails to play. It's just a matter of whether you do it correctly. Well, it's a matter of whether you do it at all in some sense, deliberately, or whether you do it correctly. And that's what we're all about here at SES, is making sure those foundational things are in place.
So let's explore that just a little bit. So what do you mean by the fact that, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, that you can't not do philosophy when you're talking about the truths of Christianity?
So I think it's important for people to realize, and I'm not so sure this is particularly that controversial necessarily, and that is that there are things about reality that as normal human beings, we really cannot fail to know. That the sun is shining on a sunny day, or that I'm sitting down rather than standing up, or I'm drinking water as opposed to coffee, or whatever. We can't really fail to know those things. So that's just part of being a human. But when it comes to some kind of in-depth analysis of aspects of those experiences and our knowledge of those experiences, then you find yourself talking about issues that are philosophical. So the illustration I often use, going back to my sun on a sunny day, you walk outside and see the sun shining, and you observe that the sun is shining, and you say, well, what a beautiful sunny day it is. You're not, quote, doing astronomy. You're not an astronomer all of a sudden because you noticed a sunny day, right? That's just being a normal human. However, to do an in-depth analysis of the sun and sunshine and its effect on the planet will involve, among other things, astronomy. So by the same token, we can make certain observations about the world around us that we see, hear, taste, touch, or smell. And that's just part of being a normal human being. But when we do a sufficiently in-depth analysis of our experience of the world and what we can learn from that, then we begin to do what has historically been referred to as philosophy. And then, of course, there are lots of different philosophical voices that have flowed into the conversation over the past 2,500 years in Western civilization, not to mention other voices from other cultures around the world. So then it just becomes a matter of, okay, if we're going to start waxing detailed about the observation of the sun, then we have to own up to the conversation of astronomers. If we're going to do that about philosophical issues like truth or knowledge or good or God's existence, then we have to sort of pony up and pay the dues, if you will, of the requirements of philosophical investigation.
I appreciate that, and I think we're doing a good job, at least as a seminary, of equipping our students to think that way. And I say that just from my own personal experience, because when I entered it, and I've said this before on here, when I entered SES, literally, I'd never had a philosophy class in my life. And my first foray into philosophy was moral philosophy with one of our former professors, and I thought he was talking a foreign language. I had no idea what he was talking about. And somehow I managed to not fail the class and did fairly well. But really, it was just being introduced little by little to these philosophical ideas and the important role they play in the apologetics specifically, that really pricked my interest. And then as I started seeing bit by bit how these things influence our theology and our hermeneutics and all of this stuff, lo and behold, I end up coming out with an MA in philosophy. So for me, it was really cool. I really enjoyed it and appreciated it. So let's jump in to the infographic. Again, we're talking with Dr. Richard Howe, SES Provost, about a newly released infographic that we have at the seminary that you can download at ses.edu/infographic, where we go through three main sections outlining 9 basic arguments for the truthfulness of Christianity. And of course, that's distilled down from our really foundational standpoint of Dr. Geisler's 12 points that show Christianity's true. So we're really building off of that and just honing into specific areas. But the first thing we list is Uh, and again, this may sound like a weird place to start to a lot of people, but the fact that we need to now argue uh, for the fact that objective truth exists and is knowable. So we literally have to start now with the fact that we can know truth about reality. Uh, why do we have to start there? That seems so elementary to a lot of people.
Well, you're exactly right that it may seem like an odd place to start. In fact, I would submit to you, to our viewers, that all three of these points that we're going to touch on here, God willing, will strike some people as, well, that's an odd thing to even have to say, or I don't even know what that means. Or what is worse, that all three of these in some quarters will be flat out rejected. So they, rather than, well, that's an odd place to start, or I've never heard of that before, they say, oh, that's definitely not only not a place to start, but it has no place at all in philosophical thinking. So we have to be prepared to respond to any one of those kinds of initial reactions. But I think it's unfortunate, but I think fewer and fewer people would be the ones you would run into to go, well, why would we even have to talk about that? And what I mean is, normal people are running into more and more often people who act as if there is no objective truth about fact around us, that every point of view is just a perspective, if you will, and that any one perspective is no more or less viable or legitimate than anyone else's perspective. And this is in philosophy, in some quarters, this is referred to as postmodernism. It's called postmodernism, post meaning after, and modernism being rightly or wrongly characterized as a strong emphasis on the objectivities of the natural sciences. So there was a movement that began to emerge in Anglo-American philosophy in the really the early 20th century, really started seeing definitive statements that challenged this modernist idea that science, that is the natural sciences, could give us all we need to know about human life and human flourishing. Now, as Christians, we would say, well, isn't that true? Isn't it good to respond against that? That science isn't the do all and end all of human knowing, and we would say yes, it is. The problem with postmodernism, however, is I think they've identified the wrong things as to what was wrong with modernism. So, for example, the fact that there are objective truths about reality that we could know as human beings, like whether it is or isn't a sunny day, or whether God does or does not exist, he either exists or he doesn't. The fact that there are these kind of objective truths, that's not what was wrong with modernism. What was wrong with modernism, sometimes might be referred to as scientism, was the fact that everything that could be known could be reduced just to the laws of physics, if you will. Well, that's not actually true. There are metaphysical truths that we'll get into here in due course, and there are also spiritual truths that we can know. They're still objectively true, however. So it's not that modernism in its totality was wrong. It was just wrong in thinking that the boundaries were set at the physical. And so we, as Christians, and others who weren't even Christians said, well, there's more to this than just the physical. Problem with postmodernism is it, again, threw the baby out with the bathwater, if you will, and started misidentifying, well, exactly what is it about modernism that we need to move beyond? And one of the things it mistakenly thought was the fact that there was objective truth. So we contend for the fact that there are some truths about reality that we cannot fail to know with our normal faculties of our senses and our rationality.
So let's define our terms to make sure we're all on the same page, essentially. So, what do we mean by truth, and what exactly do we mean by objective? Because that term gets thrown around a lot, and sometimes people mean different things by that.
So, truth, philosophers have a way of giving labels to complex ideas, and the labels can be very helpful as long as we make sure we are conversant enough with what the label is about. So, historically, what we would argue as classical realists or Thomistic realists here at SES is that truth is correspondence to reality. So when I say it is a sunny day, then that statement would be true if it is a sunny day in reality, and would be false if it's not a sunny day in reality. So how the statement I'm making corresponds to what is factual is called correspondence theory of truth, and that's what we mean by true. Now, to be sure, you could qualify that to say, well, it's a sunny day in Atlanta and it's not a sunny day in Charlotte, or it's a sunny day today, but it wasn't a sunny day yesterday. And those are all perfectly normal to make those qualifications, but none of those qualifications call into question the idea of, well, what is truth at bedrock? It's stating things the way that they are. Now, by objective, what we mean by that is that there are some truths, the truth of which is irrespective of the knower of that truth. If it's sunny outside, then it's sunny regardless of whether anybody is outside to know that it's sunny. It's just a fact of reality that it's sunny. In fact, even if everybody in the world was blind and couldn't even know whether it was sunny or not, it would still be sunny in reality. So that's what we mean by objective. And where I think sometimes people get a little skittish about that category is that they fail to appreciate the fact that, well, not every claim that we make is objective. So suppose I said that Brussels sprouts taste terrible. Well, is that objectively true? Well, it's objectively true that I think Brussels sprouts taste terrible, but just the statement Brussels sprouts taste bad is not necessarily objectively true. It may be true for some people that they think it tastes bad, and not true for others. They think it tastes good. All right. So there are subjective truths that are more or less relative to the person's individual tastes or maybe their circumstance. It feels cold in here to me because I've been in all day, but somebody that's been in a freezer in the grocery store and comes walking in the room may feel like it's hot in here. Okay, that's all fine. And that doesn't at all sort of threaten or compromise the concept of objectivity. So we want to contend for the fact that some things are true, some things are objectively true, and then some things can be known to be true by us. And I think that is, in effect, undeniable.
This is something I know I've struggled with and still have to remind myself of the differences, but is there a difference in saying something is absolutely true? Because we hear a lot about absolute truths and those sorts of things versus this notion of objectivity. Are they referencing the same thing? Is there something different going on there?
I think that in my hearing, most of the time when people use the term absolute, they intend to mean the same thing, but I don't think they are. So, for example, if I took the temperature outside here in the Atlanta area where I am, and let's say it's 88 degrees, okay, so that is an objective truth that it's 88 degrees. But I wouldn't use the word absolute for that because it could well be 89 degrees in an hour from now, and it was 87 degrees maybe a few hours ago. So, in other words, maybe this is just me, but I tend to take the concept of absoluteness to be something that is just unchangeably true, that God is good. For example, that's an absolute truth that doesn't change that God is good, or his other superlative attributes, that he's all powerful and all loving and these kinds of things. And so I tend to want to preserve and reserve, if you will, that absolute category for these for sort of narrow subset of objective. I think objective serves us better because otherwise we may find ourselves, if you will, painted in a corner by trying to defend a truth that is objectively true, but could change from day to day, like the temperature or even the time of the day for us as human beings. So I preserve objective, meaning it's true external to the knower, irrespective of the knower. It can be noon no matter what anybody else knows or thinks at the time. But that noon can change to 1 p.m. Later on if the Lord tarries, So I distinguish absolute and objective in that regard.
I think that's a helpful distinction. I appreciate that. So one thing that drives me absolutely insane, especially as we're dealing with our cultural issues right now, the social issues that are on the news every day and affecting us all in various ways. It's obvious that people intuitively understand this notion that truth is knowable and it is objective in some sense. At least some truths are objective in some sense. So even in this postmodern culture, really post-Christian culture that we find ourselves in, sorry, Christina, in which we find ourselves, there's still this, we want to throw out all this notion of objective truth and, it's true for you and that's okay. You have your own truth until it comes to the point of that truth impacting somebody else in a negative way. And then suddenly this whole notion of objective truth matters because it's negatively impacting me. How have we gotten to this stage? And maybe this is too deep of a question for this conversation, but how have we gotten to this stage of verbally wanting to throw out these notions, but in reality, we still live with borrowed capital, so to speak, as if these notions still matter?
I'm amazed how hard it is for some people that I've had conversations with to see when something is self-refuting. I was in a conversation with a gentleman and recently, and he quoted some thinker from, ancient Rome or whatever it was. And the quote was something to the effect that, everybody had their own perspective. And so I brought up to him, I said, well, was that just that guy's perspective? Or did he think it was really the case that everybody had their perspective? Well, either way, it's going to be problematic because if it's just his perspective, then I don't necessarily have to agree, and it wouldn't even necessarily have to be true. It's beyond just it being his perspective. But of course, he said it as if it was universally true. But if it's universally true, then it isn't just his perspective, right? So either way, the guy's in a dilemma there. What I was amazed is how hard it was to get this gentleman to see that. I was at a loss except by repeating it over and over. Well, if it's just your perspective, then it might not necessarily be true for other people. Oh, no, it's absolutely true for everybody. Well, then it isn't just your perspective. Oh, no, and I think the only thing to do is just keep doing it until maybe you have this gestalt experience. All of a sudden, we just kind of a light bulb goes on. So, yeah, one of the ways, perhaps practically speaking, is to relegate the discussion to something that people have a vested interest in. So when people go, well, who are you to shove your morality down my throat? And then you go, okay, so you don't really care whether I'm a racist or not. Oh, well, no, you shouldn't be racist. Okay, well, why is you telling me I shouldn't be racist? Why is that not just you shoving your morality down my throat?
Mm-hmm.
And just let them marinate in that a minute and see if that matters to them. So, yeah, people can be selectively objective if we're not careful until it's our vested interest. And that serves as a good opportunity to leverage the fact that, well, then objective things are objective irrespective of our interests, and try to move the argument from that point forward.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point and a great illustration and opportunity to say everything we're talking about in this infographic, again, ses.edu/infographic, if you want to download for yourself a PDF of what we're referencing here, really is just an outline of the classical apologetic method that, of course, Dr. Geisler was so famous for, I guess, making more popular or more well-known,
Yes,
and what the seminary is founded upon, of course. And the beauty of that is, just as you said, it doesn't matter what the topic of conversation is. We can launch from any point in conversation to this argument for why Christianity is true, and that everything we talk about, as you say, I love to quote you saying, there's no part of reality that anybody can stand that doesn't point to its creator. And to me, that is just the beauty of this methodology. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And it is really the essential part of our classical approach, that very fact. What becomes contentious unnecessarily in some context is how do we show that that's the fact? But we don't find ourselves very often having to prove to somebody that the world around them actually exists external to them. Most people wouldn't even consider doubting that unless they saw the Matrix, perhaps, or dabbled in some kind of Descartes or whatever. And so getting people to see why that's the case is then the very hallmark of the classical method, to show what are the metaphysical truths that account for the fact that we are even here in the first place. That's the cosmological argument. and that we can know what we know as knowers, as far as part of our philosophical anthropology, is a subset of that metaphysics and such. That is the very essence of the classical method. It, in some cases, doesn't necessarily have to go into the philosophy, but as we've already seen, as we're already seeing in our culture in the past few decades, we're being forced more and more to deal with it at this level of the philosophical. When people say, "Well, truth is just really power," as
Hmm.
Michel Foucault would argue, for example, our truth is just the expanding the greatest amount of consensus that we can get as a community, as Roy would have it. And we go, well, no, that's not what we mean by truth. And that couldn't even be what you mean by truth by telling me what you think truth actually is. You're telling me that this is actually what truth is because you think that definition corresponds to reality.
Right.
Well, then that's the correspondence theory truth, not the power, truth is power view, or the truth is consensus view, or whatever.
Hmm. And that's, again, it's a great point that if this first point is not true, if the argument is not sound, then none of the rest of what we have to say matters, which is why we start with this point of truth about
Absolutely.
reality is knowable, exists, and it is knowable. So let's move on to the next point, and really the second and third arguments, if you will, are probably some of the most contentious in our modern day, even within evangelical circles.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they have drastic, just really, really bad consequences if we
You're having trouble
reject
putting
these
it in
things.
language.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So that's a great segue to the second argument that we need to make is that language is a sufficient medium to convey objective truth. What in the world
Yeah.
does that mean?
Yes. So it comes into play maybe at different levels as to whether or not that is the case, or what does it look like. And so we're interested as apologists as to where that level really has practical import in terms of being able to convince people of the truth. Here is another occasion for people to be self-refuting, that they stomp their feet and insist that language is inadequate for us to convey objective truth. They're only able to convey that by means of the use of language. So it becomes self refuting when they, by means of language, try to argue that language isn't a means by which we can make argument. It's self refuting. Hopefully, people can see that it's self refuting when they do that. This is not to say that there aren't things antecedent to language, like, for example, the existence of external reality. The fact that there is a tree out there for me to see is obviously prior to me talking about the tree, or at least talking about it in some way that I learned about it, in which case somebody else encountered the tree and they talked about it and I read what they wrote. Somehow there's got to be this reality within which the conversation about reality goes on. So we're not saying everything is just language ultimately, as some philosophers might suggest, or at least reducible to the sort of strictures of language, the way some philosophers may have done, like say early Wittgenstein and the Tractatus, perhaps, or even a little bit more fluid in later in his philosophical investigations and such. We're not saying just merely that. We're saying, however, that language, to the degree that it is an instrument that humans use to communicate truth to ourselves and to others, is adequate to communicate that truth. Also, and this will be something perhaps we'll get into either later in this stream or maybe one of the next two, we're not saying that our language is capable of being exhaustive of all of reality, because we certainly think that there is this there's a depth of God's being that is beyond our finite ability to communicate. In that case, we speak by means of analogy, for example, where we can liken God along the contours of the physical world. He's like a consuming fire, and his eyes roam to and fro in the earth. And we use the categories of God's creation to talk about God. Well, in fact, God told us through his special revelation that that's exactly what we do in Romans 1:20, Psalm 19, things like that, that talk about how language is able to convey these truths about God. So we acknowledge the boundaries of our own finitude, but the boundaries of our finitude doesn't imply that we fall absolutely short of being able to grasp truths about reality primarily the physical world around us, from which we leverage the arguments to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Father of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
So I want to bring point 1 and 2 together because I remember the first time I heard you present on this. It was just one of those light bulb moments for me.
Oh,
Just thought it was really cool, and I don't think we can remind people too much about this because I know we've shared this on the show before. But so if we're saying truth is that which corresponds to reality, but then we're talking about speaking truthfully. We say the Bible is the Word of God. It's inerrant. It is true in all that it affirms, and all of these sorts of things. Yet we're talking about analogical language and God being a lion and all these metaphors and similes and all these figures of speech.
mm-hmm.
How do we marry those two things together to say that we're then using language to correspond to reality?
Yeah, I have a presentation where I think I've identified for myself at least about 11 or so different ways to correspond. So correspondence to reality, when a proposition corresponds to reality, we're not confined to say that correspondence is limited to literal. So we could literally, Jesus walked by the sea where they were casting their nets and called his disciples. Well, surely he's literally walking by a literal sea and they're literally casting literal nets, right? But there are other places where just normal human conversation employs other ways to say something true that's not literally true. So as Joel chapter 2 says, that the moon will turn to blood. Well, I don't know any Jew or Christian, or for that matter, Muslim, who thinks that the moon, the physical moon, would literally become liquid with corpuscles and all kinds of chemicals in it. No, it doesn't literally become blood, but it in that instance, I would argue, as Bible scholars would have argued, and commentators, that it's a figure of speech, a language of appearance, sometimes called phenomenological language. In that instance, why is it called turning into blood? Because it turns red as blood is red, which it does every full lunar eclipse. If you're able to see it, it turns real dark orangish red color. So language of appearance is a way. Well, does that mean it's not corresponding? No, not at all. It's just corresponding phenomenologically, if you will. Well, as you begin to just examine the way we talk in terms of similes, as you've already mentioned. That the scriptures, I forget the reference exactly, but it talks about the Israelites. Their hearts were moved as the wind moves the leaves of the trees. Yeah, that's a simile. Well, how does a wind move the leaves of the trees? Well, it physically is manipulating the leaf. Well, is that what their hearts were? Well, no, it's not. It's not talking that. It's talking poetically. Isaiah 55 talks about the trees clapping their hands. Well, do trees clap their hands? Well, not literally. It's a poetic language, a metaphor. And so I've tried to identify in my presentation titled "God Fading Away" and other presentations that one can get a hold of. Where there's I don't know 11 or so ways to correspond. And by the way, Adam, I think a lot of these ways of corresponding, understanding different ways to correspond, are directly applicable to the debate over inerrancy, because critics sometimes will pick out a verse and they mistakenly take the verse literally rather than some other part of speech, and then try to leverage that as an argument for it being an error, when all they had to do was realize that's not a literal statement, that's a metonymy or a synecdoche or a metaphor or a simile or any other number of ways. And we could argue about whether it is or isn't that. That's fair. But you can't just automatically assume because it isn't literal that therefore something is mistaken when it says that God walked in the garden in Genesis 3 or whatever. You gotta do a little bit more homework than just that.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this has tremendous impacts on our hermeneutics, has tremendous impacts on our theology proper when we're studying the nature of God. What is God like? All of these sorts of things. So, philosophically, then, what's going on behind the scenes, so to speak, And we'll move this, I guess, out of the realm of the unbeliever into the realm of the church, because apologetics not only serves our evangelism, it serves our discipleship for believers. So philosophically, what's going on behind the scenes when we go to Bible studies, for example, and we hear the questions, well, what does this verse mean to you? How do you understand this verse and those kind of things? Because really, that boils down to a philosophical issue. So what's going on there with this understanding of language and meaning?
So, it would be catastrophic if we regarded each other conversation with us the way a lot of people take their Bible. I mean, you're so glad your airline pilot didn't take his flight manual the way some people take their Bible, where they just take a verse, what we would call a verse, a statement or whatever out of the Bible, completely ignore its context, and then try to leverage some kind of theology on the basis of that. And that could be catastrophic. Um, and so what's going on a lot of times, I actually do a Bible study, if you can call that a Bible study. I actually do a Bible study titled, "What Does This Verse Mean to You?" And the subtitle is the most commonly taken out of context verses. I mean most common in my experience of people taking verses out of context. And I've identified a number of different kinds of context, the most obvious of which is, well, what about the verses before and after? When Jesus says in Matthew to the disciples, "Go into the city and loose the donkey and bring it to me," you probably wouldn't want to leverage some argument about whether you've loosed your donkey for Jesus, where they sort of make it an allegory, so to speak, and the donkeys of your life that you have to loose to bring to Jesus. And people preach the Bible that way. I've heard sermons that way, where they're throwing the cargo off the ship when Paul was being taken prisoner to Rome, and the sermon was on lightening your load. You had to throw things out of your life to lighten your load or whatever. And so to me, this is just a travesty of biblical interpretation or lack thereof. It's doing violence to the way that we should be conscientious about the Bible and indeed all discourse. We would never again, as I said, take a flight manual or a surgical procedure and just treat it as if it's an allegory. Whatever. Why don't you literally do this? I mean, you just kind of metaphor. No, we wouldn't do that. Yet, for some reason, we've developed a habit as a culture in America, especially, to do that with our Bible. And so these things ought not be. We have to be able to understand language, the parts of speech, uses of language in the context in which not only the literal context, the original language also provides a context. The culture in which the Bible was written provides a context. There's a philosophical context that undergirds God's special revelation, as we've already made reference to. There are other kinds of contexts where we're even sometimes even just the sheer English context. Forget the original language. Even the English sometimes is ignored. All of these are important. Now, here we're probably not saying anything that is not shared by most evangelical seminaries, at least in principle. But where I think we would be different at SES is we would argue that we, almost unique among evangelical seminaries, have the proper philosophical and metaphysical foundation to substantiate this objective hermeneutics that maybe a broader spectrum of evangelicals would share with us. In other words, they're not able to leverage an argument about the nature of reality in such a way that it actually explains why they're so committed to their objectivity and their hermeneutics, for example. I mean, I'm glad they're still doing it, but it's only a matter of time before that'll begin to erode, because the philosophical grounding for that is being so chiseled away by all of these other toxic philosophical voices, like a Foucault or a Rorty or earlier late Wittgenstein or whomever you want to, or Descartes for that matter. That's at some point, as C.S. Lewis said, good philosophy must exist if for no other reason than bad philosophy needs to be answered. There are other reasons, but at least that has to be contended with in order to sustain these cherished commitments we have as evangelicals.
And we see that even in our own hermeneutics text, the hermeneutical spiral by Grant Osborne. Wonderful nuts and bolts and practical steps for hermeneutics and exegesis. And then in the appendix talks about the fact that because of our various perspectives and worldviews, we can't arrive at an objective meaning of the
Absolutely.
text.
Yeah.
Well, why did you just write your book? What is the
Yeah.
point?
Just sawed the limb off he was sitting on.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So, and he's a evangelical brother in Christ, making
Mhm.
these same philosophical mistakes. So, we're just scratching the surface here. I mean, there's so much to talk
Mhm.
about, and I do. Before I forget, I do want to mention if you're interested in some of the presentations and things that Dr. Howe has mentioned, you can visit Richard G. Howe. That's G as in what is it? Good looking, is that right? RichardGHowe.com. And he's got tons of PDF decks of his slides and different things on his website. So be sure to check that out. Again, we're scratching the surface, but we have to move on to our last philosophical foundational argument that is probably maybe the most contentious of what we have to say. And that is the fact that every natural thing in the universe has a distinct nature. First of all, what does that mean? And second of all, who cares? Why does that matter?
Yes. Well, to answer your last question first, we care, right? So we care, and then we want an opportunity to tell you why you ought to care
That's
if
right.
you don't yet. Yeah. So a nature, in the sense in which we're meaning it here, is a metaphysical issue, whatever that means. What it means is we're arguing that there's something about things like a tree or a human or a dog, as opposed, by the way, as we'll contrast, artificial things like a pizza or a knife, things that are artificial. We're drawing a distinction here. Things that are natural in the world, they have some metaphysical aspect in virtue of which they are the kind of thing that they are. A human is a different kind of thing than a dog, let's say, and either of those are different than a plant, and they're different, let's say, from a rock. And so, as natural objects, and this, by the way, finds its origins in the ancient Greeks and was, I would argue, assumed by the Old Testament prophets and the Old Testament scriptures. You see all the way in Genesis the distinction between human and other animals in creation, and indeed the whole rest of creation. Certain distinction there. Well, the distinction just is this nature that we're talking about. Now, the cash value of that is that you take, for example, are the contemporary controversies over critical theory broadly, but more narrowly the critical race or the critical justice or critical gender or whatever else you want to talk about it. The application of critical theory to subsets. These things are conducting themselves with sometimes tacit, sometimes explicit rejection of the idea that there is a such thing as a human nature. Now, why does that matter? Because it's, and again, this may be more detailed than we want to go into. I'll let you make a judgment there and you can cut me off. But it's only by having a certain nature that we can even begin to define and then understand what is the good of that nature. In other words, when your doctor gives you a prescription, he's not indifferent as to whether it's an MD writing a prescription for a human versus a veterinarian writing a prescription for a dog. He's not indifferent to that because humans are different kinds of things than dogs. And so even physically, there are going to be things that make a difference between life and death in terms of diet, behavior, medicines, and these kind of things, all because of the difference in the kind of thing that it is. So what is good or bad for a human is different than what is good or bad for a dog. And then what we would do as Christians to say, then the whole subset of moral good comes into play. More than just, well, what's good for you, this medicine, that diet, this exercise. More than just that, we have a subset of the good called moral good, which then is ultimately connected with our eternal relationship with God, unlike a dog or a tree or a rock in that regard. And so while people may intuitively think they know that some things are good or bad for humans, when there's bad philosophical voices in the conversation, it becomes incumbent upon us as Christians more and more to make the philosophical case of what it is to be a human and then how it is we can argue for human good in light of what it is to be a human. I would submit to you, Adam, that for a long, maybe millennia in human thought, you can trace the fact that most people, that in terms of what they think, in terms of religion and philosophies, have recognized the human good and human flourishing and what is a good human being. And then from that very recognition, we try to leverage this argument for Christianity. But again, when some philosophical voices begin to flow in that begin to erode that philosophical basis, all of a sudden now it becomes up for grabs as to exactly what is human versus what is something else in the environment. And should we prioritize this particular animal over human life, for example? And when that kind of deleterious voice comes in, we've got to triage the conversation and try to re-inject a solid philosophical argument to show why it is that it matters that there is a such thing as human nature, and then here's what flows from those truths about human nature.
And of course, this idea of nature is exactly where we get this notion of natural law. That's the nature to which we're referring, not the natural laws of the strong and weak nuclear force and those kind of things. We're talking this idea of metaphysical natures of things, which really is at least part of what we mean by being realists in some sense, as we teach at the seminary. So what are the contrasting views to that? Why would someone not be a realist? Because it seems kind of commonsensical when you think about it.
Yeah, it does seem commonsensical, and I know this is again self-serving for us to say as classical realists, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find people who weren't realists in the history of ideas that only rejected realism because of some deep philosophical argument. In other words, left to their own devices as a quote normal. I keep using the word normal. I got in trouble with a friend of mine at church for contrasting normal with the rest of us. What I mean by that is somebody who isn't necessarily disposed to want to do philosophy and apologetics, just a regular human being. In fact, what all of us, even at SES, were before we did apologetics, right? We're just regular human beings, but then we become attracted to and skilled to greater or lesser extent in the apologetics there. So yeah, it is a normal kind of thing. So what are some of the options? Well, it really runs a spectrum. The shortest way to characterize the spectrum is there are sort of three options. On the one end of the spectrum is the idea that these kinds, human, tree, dog, that those things which philosophers later on begin to call universals, because they seemingly apply universally to all members of that kind. So every individual human is part of the kind human, right? So human is a universal. On the one end of the spectrum was Plato, who would make these universals, if you will, really the things that are real in the world. These universal, transcendent, what he called the forms. And you'll get into the details of that in an intro to a philosophy class, my classical philosophy class, for example, at the seminary, and then more in depth in the metaphysics classes that we offer at the seminary. But that's Plato. He thought really what wasn't fully real wasn't individual humans and individual trees, but humanness and treeness and justice and goodness, right? Now, at the other end of the spectrum would be a total repudiation to say, you know what? The only things that are real are just the individuals. And all that we mean by the supposed universals are just names. They're just inventions in our own mind and cataloging. But there's nothing metaphysically real at all. And by the way, in my hearing, most of the time when you hear the debate go on within evangelicals at the philosophical level, the debate is always between these two extremes. It's always Plato on the one end, let's say Occam, or maybe even Hume on the other end. And it's always that debate. So at SES, we started noticing, well, there's a middle option here that's sort of halfway. And that originates with Aristotle and then is augmented and, if you will, brought to fruition by Aquinas for the Christian perspective on all of this, if I may use the word perspective in light of our objectivity conversation earlier. And that is just sometimes called moderate realism. Well, what does it say? It says, well, look, first of all, the constituents of reality are individual things. This human being, that tree, this dog. Those are the constituents of reality. First of all, but my intellect is able to abstract from this human, that human, this universal called human. Now, in my intellect, it exists as a universal. Is it real? Well, it's real in the sense that it's abstracted from something that is real. Well, what's it abstracted from in the individual? Their nature. This individual human has a human nature. It's a metaphysical constituent. It's not universal, it's particular in this one and that one. But intellects are able to grasp these things and bring them in and understand them at the level of the conceptual, if you will, the universal. So it's still a realism because it grounds itself in the reality of that metaphysical element in the particular, known as the form, to use Plato's word, or the nature. Now, what Christianity goes on to do to say, and all of these different concepts, human, tree, dog, or whatever, all pre-existed in God's mind as their creator. If we can use again the imagery of our minds as humans and how we think as finite, physical, spiritual human beings, and speak analogously of God, God had all of these ideas and decided to make some of them real, make trees and human beings and dogs, and they become real things in his creation. But they pre-existed before he created them in his mind as their maker. That's sometimes called the conceptualism, but I wouldn't die on the hill for that term because that gets thrown around a lot of different ways. But you've got the extreme realism of Plato, the moderate realism of Aristotle and Aquinas, and then the nominalism. We didn't give it that name, but meaning that they're just names. There's nothing real metaphysically in the individual from which I got that concept. That's Occam, or maybe even Hume. Those are the perspectives. So we are realists in this respect, but not Platonic. We're more of this Aristotelian and then Thomistic understanding of realism. And I would argue you can't make sense of the world fully without some kind of acknowledgement of this metaphysical aspect of God's creation that we call the form or the nature or some other words that might get attached to it.
There's so much there, and I wish we had the time to unpack that, which of course would take an entire course. But it's fairly.
Hey, that's an idea.
How about that? It's fairly easy to see if this idea of natures is true, that lays the foundation for natural law. It's fairly easy to see at least the connection, whether you agree with it or not, with moral arguments such as the case against homosexual behavior and abortion and euthanasia and all those sorts of things. But in reality, if this metaphysical makeup of physical things is true, it is what gives us the ability to know things, to know texts, to get the objective meaning from text, and all of these metaphysical truths. I love how your brother, Tom Howe, another one of our professors, builds this stair-step case of metaphysics and epistemology and linguistics and hermeneutics, and just one building on top of the other, because they're so interwoven. And if you get this metaphysical truth about nature's wrong, it's going to impact your ability to really at least justify your ability to know anything about reality. So as we close out here, again, we've been talking about the philosophical foundations aspect of our recently released infographic on 9 essential arguments for effective Christian apologetics. So you can download that at ses.edu/infographic. But just to set the stage for next week, when we move into more of some of the classical apologetics, existence of God, that kind of thing, as we move into that for next week, just set the stage a bit for, and you've already done this a bit, of how this idea of natures and truth essentially allows us to build arguments then for God's existence from physical reality that we experience.
And I'm glad you're giving me that opportunity, because I don't want the viewers to worry about the fact that, well, so far we haven't really brought God into the equation. And I think especially about some of our presuppositionalist brothers and sisters who that's one of their criticisms. Like, look, they went a whole hour talking philosophy and they never even brought God up, except obliquely here and there in the context of trees and people and other things, or whatever out there. Maybe I did that. But of course, what we're trying to show is that this is part of a stream of points in an overall argument for Christianity. So unless and until the philosophical foundations are in place, which a lot of times you don't need to necessarily triage it if it's already in place, if people already know there's truth, okay, don't try to fix something that isn't broken. But of course, our culture is more and more getting away from that. Only because those things are in place can we then appreciate what the classical arguments for God's existence and God's attributes are. It's not a generic theism, as presuppositionalists like to disparage it. It's a theism of the only true God that there is. And that's what we are laying the foundation for being able to show how that's the case as we go into the second part of this about leveraging arguments for God's existence and for his attributes. It's all going to be grounded in these basic philosophical starting points.
So again, we've only had an hour. We've barely scratched the surface, and this whole case. This is 1 hour on just scratching the surface of these things, and we have 2 more episodes to go. But we need a whole course on these things. So, do we have something like that coming up?
We do have something like that coming up. So I'm doing a course in Introduction to Apologetics, a module. Now, I don't have the dates exactly right in front of me. You may have
August
that.
16th through the 21st.
Hopefully before August 16th, I would have figured out what the dates are. So I would know to show up. Yeah, this is exactly what we do. This is the template I use for that course. Philosophical foundations, existence and nature of God, and then the truths of Christianity. Each of those now are further expanded in other courses. I teach an Introduction to Philosophy course titled Classical Philosophy. It's also a module. That's not until October of this year, but just to throw that in with a little extra there. But this Introduction to Christian Apologetics module, it's live stream, and Adam can give you as much details about it as he wants, and where to go on SES to find out about it. But we'll do that in a whole week, and you'll probably halfway through the week want to pay tuition a second time. You don't have to do that, but that's probably what you'll want to do because you'll be having so much fun.
Yes, so our module courses, for those who don't know, are boiled down to 1 week. It's the same amount of content you get in a semester, but you just meet every evening for about 4 hours an evening during the week, and then most of the day on Saturday. So you get all the classroom time done in that week, and then you have the remaining 14 weeks or whatever to do the readings and the writing assignments and those kind of things. So Intro to Apologetics will be coming up August 16th through the 21st. And of course, you can visit ses.edu to see how you can apply for that, whether you want to take it for credit, whether you want to audit it, whatever that may look like for you. Well, Dr. Howe, as always, it's been fun. It has been a pleasure. So one more time, let us know where folks can go to learn more about you specifically and some of your resources.
So I invite people to my website, richardghowe.com, and you can follow the links. You want to go to Resources tab. All the presentations that I do in PowerPoint, I've converted into PDF decks, if you will, slide decks. And so just scroll through there and see which one, and reach out to me. You can get me through the seminary, rhowe@ses.edu, and we can converse about some of this, and hope to see you sign up for the course coming up.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to speaking with you again next week, and we appreciate your time today.
All right. You're welcome. Thanks.
Thanks. Take care. Well, again, that was Dr. Richard G. Howe, SES Provost, and we've been talking about our recently released infographic of 9 essential arguments for effective Christian apologetics. So you can find that at ses.edu/infographic. And I would also encourage you, if you are interested in learning more about becoming a student, obviously you can visit ses.edu, but I would also encourage you to go to degrees.ses.edu/podcast. degrees.ses.edu/podcast. You can download a free ebook, 3 Reasons Why Seminary Education May Be Right for You. It goes into some of the reasons why seminary education is different than just learning things on your own, which is obviously great. But also, specifically, if you haven't figured it out already, what exactly makes SES a unique educational opportunity for you within the evangelical world. So I hope you'll do that. And of course, we can't do any of this, whether it's training students, providing content, or whatever, without your support. So visit ses.edu to learn more about ways you can partner with us, whether that's prayerfully, financially, whatever that looks like for you. As always, we call the show Why Do You Believe? And the only reason to believe anything is because it's true. And now we know what truth means and that it is knowable. So go share truth with someone today.
Providing an integrated approach to theology, philosophy, and apologetics that will equip you to proclaim the gospel, engage the culture, and defend the truth. That's SES.